James Carter sat in the executive office, the same one he had walked into for the past 40 years. But today, something felt different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Across from him, Richard Calloway, the company's CEO, leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. James adjusted his tie, trying to steady his nerves. "Richard, I appreciate you calling me in. I assume this is about my promotion?" His voice was calm, professional, like always. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "James, James." He sighed dramatically, as if he actually felt sorry. "You've been here a long time." 40 years, James confirmed. "Right, and that's the problem." Calloway leaned forward, fingers interlocking. "You're old, James. This company needs fresh blood." James felt the words like a punch to the gut. He had dedicated his entire life to this place. Late nights, weekends, sacrifices. He had trained half the executives in this building, including Calloway himself. And now he was being tossed aside like yesterday's trash? Before he could respond, another voice cut in. "You just don't fit the company's new look," Tyler McAdams added. A young, cocky executive in his early 30s, Tyler sat beside Calloway, smirking like a hyena circling its prey. James's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He knew exactly what they meant. "Let's cut to the chase," Calloway said, sliding a folder across the desk. "That's your severance package. It's generous. Sign it, walk away, and you'll get your pension." James stared at the papers without touching them. His name was already printed at the top, as if they had prepared this long before today. His mouth felt dry. "And if I don't?" Calloway's smirk widened. "Then you lose everything." The words hit like a slap. James's heartbeat pounded in his ears. His entire career, all the sweat, the effort, meant nothing to these men. He was being erased. Before he could process the betrayal, movement caught his eye. Two large security guards appeared at the office door, their expressions blank, waiting for a command. James's pulse spiked. They were treating him like a criminal, like they expected him to fight. He swallowed hard, gripping the arms of the chair. A cold dread settled in his chest. Calloway leaned back, completely at ease. "So, what's it gonna be, James?" The guards took a step forward. James had no idea what to do next. The walls felt like they were closing in. And in that moment, James realized he wasn't walking out of here on his own terms. A firm grip clamped onto James Carter's arm. He barely had time to react before the second security guard flanked him, grabbing his other arm as if he were a threat. His breath hitched. "Wait a damn minute," James snapped, trying to plant his feet. "I've been here longer than both of you combined." Calloway tilted his head, pretending to consider James's words before flashing an insincere smile. "And yet, I'm the boss." James's stomach churned with fury. "You're making a mistake, Richard." "Doubt it," Calloway mused, tapping his fingers on the desk. Tyler leaned against the wall, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "You heard the man. Get this relic out of here." The guards didn't hesitate. With mechanical precision, they tightened their grip and marched James toward the door. James fought to keep his composure, his heart pounding. The office floor stretched out before him. Desks, cubicles, employees. People he had mentored. People who had once respected him. And now, they all pretended not to see. Some lowered their heads, typing furiously to appear busy. Others turned their backs. A few dared to steal quick, guilty glances, but looked away just as fast. Not one person spoke up. A lump formed in James's throat. He wasn't expecting a parade of sympathy, but this felt like a death sentence. As he passed HR, his eyes flicked toward the glass office where a young assistant typed out an email. His gut twisted when he saw the subject line. James Carter's retirement announcement. Retirement? They were erasing him like he was some washed-up, tired old man. He clenched his jaw, feeling the heat rise in his chest. He wasn't some useless relic. He had built this place. The guards pushed open the front doors, leading him into the cold air of the company's grand entrance. His feet hit the pavement, and just like that, he was outside. No job, no pension, no plan. The doors shut behind him with a hollow thud. James exhaled, staring at the towering glass building that had been his second home for 4 decades. And in that moment, it hit him. He had just lost everything. James had barely made it to his car when his phone buzzed. He fumbled for it with trembling hands, still reeling from what had just happened. But instead of an apology, an explanation, something, His eyes landed on an email notification. James Carter has retired. A cold chill ran down his spine. HR had sent out the announcement within minutes of him being thrown out. No farewell party, no speeches, no acknowledgement of his 40 damn years at the company. Just a sterile, soulless email, as if he had quietly walked away on his own terms. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the phone as his vision blurred with rage. A second notification flashed across his screen. LinkedIn. He tapped it, and his stomach twisted when he saw the latest post from Tyler Shaw. Excited to lead this company into the future with a fresh, modern vision. Out with the old, in with the new. The comments were rolling in. Congrats, Tyler. Big things coming. About time for some fresh leadership. James's breathing turned shallow. Fresh leadership? Out with the old. Was that how they were spinning this? After 4 decades of breaking his back, of building this company from the ground up, training guys like Tyler, this was how it ended. His hands balled into fists against the steering wheel. Then he glanced at the towering office building through the windshield. His office, was up there on the 15th floor. And by now it was probably already empty, cleared out, scrubbed clean, as if he had never even been there. His nameplate, tossed. His awards, gone. The years of dedication, wiped away in an instant. James let out a bitter laugh. They didn't just fire him, they erased him. A loud ding jolted him back to reality. A text. Unknown number. I heard what happened. Let's meet. His brows furrowed. James had no idea who it was. But right now, he had nothing left to lose. With one last glance at the company that betrayed him, James took a deep breath and texted back. James sat in his car, staring at the mysterious text. I heard what happened. Let's meet. He didn't recognize the number. No name. No details. Just an invitation. James had half a mind to ignore it. What was the point? His career was over, his name scrubbed from the company's history, and Calloway was probably celebrating his downfall with a glass of expensive whiskey. But something gnawed at him. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. He had never felt this defeated in his life. Sighing, he typed back, James, who is this? Unknown. Just meet me at the Silver Spoon Diner. 1 hour. James hesitated. The Silver Spoon was a small, old-school diner on the edge of town, a place where big deals didn't happen. Just coffee, conversation, and maybe a slice of pie. Something told him to go. So with nothing left to lose, James started the car and drove. The diner bell jingled as James stepped inside. It was mostly empty, just a few truckers and a waitress wiping down the counter. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. And then he saw him. Shaquille O'Neal, sitting in a booth near the back, sipping a vanilla milkshake like he had all the time in the world. James blinked. Wait, what? Shaq looked up, grinned, and gestured to the seat across from him. James slowly walked over. He wasn't starstruck. He was confused. Sliding into the booth, he cleared his throat. I didn't expect you. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, most people don't. He set his milkshake down. James Carter, right? James nodded slowly. Shaq leaned forward, his expression turning serious. I heard what happened to you today, and I don't like it. James sighed, rubbing his face. Yeah, well, it's done. Calloway won. He wanted me gone, and he made sure I left with nothing. Shaq tilted his head. You really believe that? James scoffed. What else is there to believe? Shaq studied him for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Let me tell you something, James. His fingers flew across the screen. Calloway thinks he's untouchable, thinks he can push out the people who built his company and get away with it. James exhaled. Because he can. Shaq smirked. See, that's where you're wrong. James frowned. Shaq held up his phone. I don't just play basketball, James. I invest. I own businesses. And I hate people like Calloway. James shook his head. Look, I appreciate this. But what can you do? Shaq grinned. A lot more than you think. Then without another word, he pressed a button on his phone and lifted it to his ear. Yo, get my team on the phone. We're about to shake things up. James watched, stunned, as Shaq leaned back, completely unfazed. Then he said something that made James's heart pound. Give me 1 day. Shaq sat in the quiet booth of the diner, stirring his milkshake with slow, deliberate movements. Across from him, James Carter still looked dazed, his hands resting on the table, fingers slightly curled, as if gripping onto the last remnants of his old life. "You still look like you don't believe this is real," Shaq said, raising an eyebrow. James let out a tired laugh, shaking his head. "It's not that. It's just, I gave them everything. 40 years, and they threw me out like I was nothing." His voice faltered for a moment, then hardened. "I don't even know where to go from here." Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the table. "You're not done yet, James. Calloway thinks he won, but what he doesn't know?" He smirked. "This ain't over." James frowned. "What can you do?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped a contact. "Watch and learn." Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Calloway sat in his high-rise office, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The skyline stretched out before him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was focused on the celebration happening in his office. "Here's to the future of Calloway Industries," Tyler, his right-hand man, said, raising his glass. "To progress," Calloway smirked. "To leaving dead weight behind," Tyler added. They both laughed, clinking glasses, basking in the feeling of power. But power, Calloway would soon learn, could shift very quickly. Back at the diner, Shaq's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then answered with his usual calm. "Mason, what you got?" Mason, his top financial analyst, spoke quickly. "Boss, I dug into Calloway's company, and let's just say he's got problems." Shaq's expression didn't change, but James noticed the slight flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Talk to me." Mason didn't hesitate. "Calloway's been bleeding money for the last few years. He's made horrible investments, and his stockholders, they're getting nervous. If someone with serious influence steps in at the right moment, they could take this whole thing from him before he even knows what's happening." James's eyes widened. "Wait, you're saying his company isn't as stable as he pretends it is?" Mason laughed. "More like a house of cards. One strong gust, and it collapses." Shaq exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. "So, let me guess," he said smoothly. "If I make a move now, I can put Calloway in checkmate." Mason's voice held a hint of amusement. "Not just checkmate, boss. Total annihilation." Shaq hung up and turned to James, his eyes gleaming. "Oh, this just got real interesting." The numbers didn't lie. And what Shaq saw, it was worse than he expected. Sitting in his private office, Shaq scrolled through the financial reports his team had compiled on Calloway's company. The numbers flashed across his screen: declining stock prices, mounting lawsuits, and debt stacked higher than the building Calloway worked in. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. This man really thought he could just toss James out like trash? His whole empire is a sinking ship. His assistant, Malik, leaned in. "It's bad, boss. Calloway's been bleeding money for months. Investors are restless. And get this, he just took out a massive loan to cover his losses. If that debt gets called in—" Shaq finished the sentence, smirking. "He's done." Richard Calloway sat behind his massive oak desk, sipping an expensive scotch. Across from him, Tyler, his right-hand man, was sweating. "Sir," Tyler hesitated, "the numbers aren't looking good. Our last investor meeting—" Calloway waved a hand dismissively. "Relax. It's a rough patch. Happens to every company." Tyler gulped. "Sir, Shaquille O'Neal is looking into us." Calloway's grip on his glass tightened. His smirk faded. "Excuse me?" Tyler shifted in his chair. "He's been pulling financial records, analyzing our investors. We don't know what he's planning, but it's not good." Calloway scoffed. "That oversized basketball player thinks he can take me down?" He laughed. "Let him try." Tyler hesitated, then muttered, "I don't think you get it. If he moves in, our investors will side with him. He's got connections." "Real money." Calloway clenched his jaw, slamming his glass on the desk. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had everything under control until Shaq got involved. Just then, his office phone rang. Unknown number. He frowned, then answered. "Who is this?" A deep voice came through the line. Calm, steady, unbothered. "The man who's about to own your company." Calloway's face went pale. Shaq had just made his move. Richard Calloway leaned back in his oversized leather chair, looking completely amused. Across from him, Shaquille O'Neal sat with a relaxed but knowing smile, his massive frame dwarfing the sleek conference table between them. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head as if he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. He adjusted his Rolex, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "So," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. A basketball player think he can run a company now? Shaq smirked, tapping his fingers against the table. Nah. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Calloway. I don't want to be CEO. His voice was steady, controlled. I want to be your boss. Calloway's laughter exploded through the room. It was loud, obnoxious, and full of arrogance. The executives sitting near the back of the room exchanged nervous glances. Over my dead body, Calloway cackled, slamming his glass onto the table. Listen, big guy, I don't care how much money you've made from sneakers and cereal commercials. Business is war. You don't just walk in and buy a seat at the table. Shaq didn't react. He didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. With a casual flick of his wrist, he slid it across the table. The folder landed in front of Calloway with a soft thud. Then you're really gonna hate page 2, Shaq said smoothly. Calloway scoffed, flipping open the folder. His eyes skimmed over the first few lines before his smirk disappeared. The blood drained from his face. His fingers tightened on the papers as his confident posture slumped. His company's financials, his worst investments exposed, the secret internal reports of declining stocks and pending lawsuits. This isn't possible, Calloway muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq leaned back, enjoying the shift in energy. Oh, it's possible. Calloway's breathing turned shallow. For the first time, he looked nervous. His hands shook as he flipped to the next page, where Shaq's official offer to buy the company was waiting. Richard Calloway's hands trembled as he turned another page in the folder. His confidence, his arrogance, had evaporated. The room felt smaller now, closing in on him. Shaq leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He knew what Calloway was looking at. Page after page of financial ruin. The reports were airtight. Bad investments, lawsuits piling up, and a stock price that was on the verge of crashing. If the shareholders got a whiff of this, Calloway's reign would be over. You don't have a choice, Shaq said smoothly, watching Calloway's throat bob as he swallowed hard. Calloway tried to compose himself, sitting up straighter. This is fake, he muttered, flipping pages faster. There's no way. It's all real, Shaq interrupted, his voice calm but firm. And if you don't believe me, feel free to call your investors. He nodded toward Calloway's phone. But I already know what they'll say. Calloway's eyes darted across the room. His right-hand man, Tyler, sat frozen, sweat forming on his brow. Sir? Tyler's voice was shaky. We might need to consider this. Calloway snapped his head toward him. What did you just say? Tyler exhaled sharply, forcing himself to speak. Shaq's offer. It's not just good. It might be the only way out. Calloway slammed his fist onto the table. Number we don't need his money. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear creeping in. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? I'm not just offering to buy your company. I'm offering to save it. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Shaq reached forward, flipping the final page of the folder. This is my offer. It's generous. It lets you leave with your pride. He smirked. Well, what's left of it? Calloway clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the document so hard his knuckles turned white. And if I say no? Calloway asked, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Shaq's smile faded. Then I make a few more calls. I buy out your investors. I let the stock collapse under your leadership. And in a few months, he spread his arms wide. I take it anyway, for half the price. Calloway's chest rose and fell rapidly. He could feel the walls closing in. Clock's ticking, Richard, Shaq added, tapping his watch. The silence in the room was suffocating. Calloway's hand twitched. He knew he had lost. There was no way out. The man sitting across from him had backed him into a corner, and he never even saw it coming. With shaky fingers, Calloway grabbed a pen. Tyler leaned in, watching in stunned silence as Calloway scrawled his name on the line. He pushed the contract across the table, his hand trembling. Shaq now owned the company. Richard Calloway sat in the front row of the company's massive conference hall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw twitched with barely concealed rage as he watched employees file in. They whispered, confused murmurs spreading like wildfire. An emergency meeting? Called by a new owner? What the hell was going on? Then the doors opened. Shaquille O'Neal strolled in, towering over everyone, his presence instantly commanding the room. Dressed in a tailored black suit, he exuded confidence, not arrogance, just raw, undeniable power. He stepped onto the stage, adjusted the mic, and grinned. "Morning, everyone," Shaq said casually. "Surprise! I'm your new owner." The room went dead silent. Employees exchanged stunned glances. A few gasps echoed through the crowd. Tyler, Calloway's lackey, visibly paled. Calloway bolted upright. "This is a joke," he muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of his chair. Shaq's grin widened. "Oh, I promise you, it's very real." He turned his attention back to the employees, scanning their faces. Some looked nervous, some hopeful, and some, like Calloway, just plain angry. "I know this is unexpected," Shaq continued, pacing the stage. "But let me make one thing clear. I didn't buy this company to tear it down. I bought it to fix it." His eyes landed on Calloway. "Because let's be real. The last guy in charge? He ran this place like a damn country club." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Calloway clenched his fists. Shaq smirked. "Yeah, I said it." He gestured toward the employees. "You all know what I'm talking about. Hard workers being overlooked. Nepotism running wild. Promotions based on the right last name instead of the right talent." He let the words sink in before delivering the knockout punch. "That ends today." The room buzzed. A few employees nodded, hopeful. Others leaned in, eager to hear what came next. Shaq glanced down at a sheet of paper. "First order of business. We're getting rid of the toxic leadership." Calloway shot up from his chair. "You can't just—" "Actually," Shaq cut him off smoothly. "I can. That's kind of what happens when you own the whole damn company." Calloway fumed but sank back down, red-faced. Shaq let the moment linger before moving on. He turned, scanning the room, then called out a name. "James Carter, please step forward." Silence. Then slowly a man pushed through the crowd. James, the same man Calloway had publicly humiliated, fired, and dragged out of the building like a criminal, now stood at the front of the room. His hands clenched at his sides. His face was unreadable. Calloway's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, what now? You bringing him up here to embarrass him again?" Shaq ignored him, turning to James. "How many years did you work here?" James swallowed hard. 40. Shaq nodded. "And how'd they repay you?" James hesitated. Then his voice came out, steady but bitter. "They threw me out like I was nothing." Shaq looked at the employees. "That sound right to y'all?" A murmur of no's swept through the room. Heads shook. Some people actually looked ashamed. Shaq exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I didn't think so." Then he turned to Calloway with a smirk. "You're gonna hate this part." Shaq turned back to James. "How'd you like to be VP of the company that fired you?" Silence. The entire office held its breath as James Carter stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Shaquille O'Neal, the new owner of the company that had humiliated and discarded him like trash, had just offered him a position no one could have imagined. Vice president. James blinked. You serious?" Shaq's grin widened. "Dead serious." Murmurs rippled through the room. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, some shocked, some thrilled. At the front of the crowd, Richard Calloway's face contorted with rage. Tyler, his sniveling lackey, turned pale. James felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Just a day ago, he'd been dragged out of this building like a criminal. Now he was being offered one of the highest positions in the company. His hands clenched at his sides. "Mr. O'Neal," James started slowly, his voice raw with emotion. "I spent 40 years building this place up. They threw me out like I was nothing." His eyes flicked toward Calloway, who sneered but said nothing. James swallowed hard. His entire career, he'd been the man who followed orders, worked hard, and never rocked the boat. But now? Now he had a chance to turn the tide. A slow smile spread across his face. "You know what, Shaq?" James said, lifting his chin. "I think I'd like that." The office erupted. Some employees clapped. Others cheered outright. Even those who had stayed silent before couldn't hide their satisfaction. Shaq laughed, clapping James on the back. "That's what I like to hear." But across the room, Calloway slammed his fists on the table. "This is a damn joke," he roared. The cheering stopped. Eyes snapped to the former CEO, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Shaq turned lazily toward him, completely unfazed. "Something wrong, Calloway? You can't just bring him back and make him VP." Calloway sputtered, his voice shaking. "He's outdated, Shaq raised an eyebrow. "He's what?" Calloway clenched his jaw, realizing he was walking into a trap. His usual excuses wouldn't work anymore. Shaq smirked. James has more experience than anyone here. He knows his company inside and out. And unlike you, he actually gives a damn about the people who work here. Tyler shifted nervously beside Calloway. He could see it too. The tide had turned. Calloway scoffed, desperate now. The board won't allow this. Shaq's smirk deepened. Funny thing about that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of papers. I am the board. Calloway's stomach dropped. Shaq tossed the papers onto the table. And guess what? Your severance package just got a lot smaller. Calloway's face was burning red. Just yesterday, he had personally thrown James Carter out of this building, treating him like yesterday's trash. Now, James was his superior. The office buzzed with barely contained excitement. Some employees tried to stay professional, but the smirks and side eyes weren't subtle. Others whispered to one another, stealing glances at Calloway's fuming expression. James exhaled, still wrapping his head around what had just happened. VP, he had spent 40 years dedicated to this company, only to be tossed aside for fresh blood. But now he was in control. Shaq clapped him on the back, grinning. Welcome back, Mr. Carter. The office erupted in applause. James, feeling a rush of pride, smiled and nodded at his colleagues. They knew what had been done to him was wrong, and now justice had been served. But Calloway, he was seething. This is insane, Calloway suddenly roared, slamming a fist onto the table. You can't do this! Shaq, cool as ever, turned to him with an amused expression. Oh? Can't I? Calloway's hands trembled with fury. His entire career had been built on manipulating people, forcing them out, replacing them with newer, younger, better. And now, he was the one being replaced. Calloway turned to the board members seated at the back of the room. You're all just going to sit there and let this happen? The board members shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke up. Calloway's power had just crumbled in front of them. James adjusted his suit jacket, stepping forward. He kept his voice even, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You said I didn't fit the company's new look, Calloway, James said. Well, I'd say the company's got a whole new look now. Laughter rippled through the office. Calloway's breathing was heavy, his rage spiraling into desperation. Tyler, he snapped, turning to his right-hand man. Do something. Tyler swallowed hard, then glanced at Shaq, then at James, then at the room full of employees who were no longer afraid. Finally, Tyler took a step back. You're on your own, sir. Calloway's mouth fell open. Betrayed. Abandoned. Shaq leaned in close, his voice low but firm. Pack your things, Shaq said. You're done. Calloway's entire body locked up. He had never imagined this day would come. Losing everything. A security guard stepped forward. Sir, we'll escort you out. The office was dead silent. Calloway's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. He turned, looking at James, Shaq, the employees he had once ruled over, all of them watching him fall. With one last glare, Calloway grabbed his briefcase and stormed out. As Calloway reached the exit, James called out, Oh, Richard? Calloway turned, only to see James smirk. Retirement's not so bad. Calloway stormed toward the exit, his face twisted in fury. His once loyal employees whispered behind him, their smirks barely hidden. The office that had once been his kingdom now felt like a cage closing in. He had lost his power, his company, his reputation, and worst of all, he lost to the man he had tossed aside. James Carter stood at the front of the room, watching Calloway with calm amusement. 40 years of loyalty, erased in an instant. But karma? Karma worked fast. Just as Calloway reached the doors, James called out, Oh, Richard. Calloway froze. He turned slowly, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was trying not to shatter his own teeth. James crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. Retirement's not so bad. The office erupted into laughter. Calloway's face burned red. His fingers curled around the handle of his briefcase so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Security held the doors open, waiting. For the first time in his life, Calloway had no control. His empire? Gone. His money? Not enough to fix his reputation. His legacy? Destroyed in front of his own employees. And then, it got worse. A familiar sound echoed through the office. Da-ding! Phones started buzzing. Employees pulled them out. Eyes widened. Gasps spread like wildfire. Calloway frowned. What? Then he heard it. His own voice. blasting from every phone screen. James, you're old. We need fresh blood. Get this relic out of here. You just don't fit the company's new look. The very same words he had used to humiliate James. Now exposed for the entire world. Tyler turned his phone around, showing Calloway the screen. The video had gone viral, trending, blowing up. Thousands of comments, millions of views. Next, Calloway canceled. Shaq flex. Sure, karma hits hard. Calloway's breath caught. Shaq, standing tall next to James, let out a chuckle. Guess the internet doesn't like corporate snakes. The realization hit Calloway like a truck. He had spent years building himself up, stepping on anyone in his way. And now, the entire world was watching him fall. Security cleared their throats. Sir, it's time to go. Calloway took one last hollow look at the office he had ruled and walked out. The video of Calloway's downfall hit 50 million views overnight. Shaq just changed corporate history,